After listening to my own last recording on this topic, and also subsequently having a conversation with someone that I know that sort of, I'm afraid, has been taken in by a lot of the social justice rhetoric, um, and discussing some of the issues, it really, to me, helped concretize exactly where the source of the confusion and the convolution is. And I'm not going to give reference specifically to the Constitution, although this will all be relatable to it, and I will talk about it without having direct recourse to the wording, because I think it's very important just to get the thinking right. The thinking can always generally, when you're dealing with kind of sophisticated things, there's a problem when you don't actually have an independent understanding. Then there's nothing that you can sort of correlate to the complexity or the categorization which is built into text. And so, although what I discuss now might not easily slot into it, it could probably very easily be translated. And I think I will get into all the facets of how these things become convoluted and complicated. And so, I don't think the Constitution is dealing with a set of issues which are actually quite complicated. I mean, they become complicated when you come to the text with a bad belief structure, which I would just say, there's no excuse for that, as it were. But now that it's been baked into the law through secondary legislation, that's obviously problematic, and it promulgates the erroneous and false thinking and the weird kind of strange morality system that's based on generalization and stereotyping and racial essentialism. Anyway, this is just introductory, I guess. But so I guess there in this sense that there can be two kinds of interpretation about like what exactly inequality is referring to. And again, I've also said that the biggest problem with just the notion of inequality being a problem, because intrinsically, fundamentally, inequality in itself, depending on what species of inequality it is not fundamentally problematic. And in some sense, the real problem about inequality is that it belongs to the system itself. It belongs to a kind of collective notion of things. It doesn't pertain to individuals. It pertains to categories from a kind of God's eye point of view, from looking from the top down. It's very disembodied and abstracted. And when you say, well, the issue that we're dealing with, the moral issue that we're dealing with, is fundamentally an issue of inequality. This is what makes things wrong. Is the inequality in it? That's not technically correct at all. I mean, it really depends. Are you talking about equality before the law? Are you talking about equality of some facet of life? And it's okay. I'm going to get into that sort of issue. So the conflation that is happening when people obsess about inequality and assume that inequality is fundamentally what the problem is. And I don't want to be misunderstood, because it's not as if things that can be described as being an inequality are not evil because there are an inequality, but things that can be described as inequalities might then also be evil, but for independent and separate reasons. And that conflation must not happen, because as soon as you work on that kind of assumption, it leads to poisonous subsequent aspects. But again, I want to get into this. So the biggest problem is that then when you're talking about inequality from a sociological perspective, which is fundamentally arbitrary, because you're just making these categories and tracking these entities and saying that these entities somewhat have the same experience, which is never true. was interrupted for a second. What was I saying? So I mean, let me just talk a little bit loosely, I guess, about the problems of obsessing over inequality. That inequality is never in itself problematic unless there was already a moral normative expectation that the thing that is unequal should be equal. And that has to be very firmly founded in morality, not in hypothetical historical contrasts or some such thing. So the idea that a people in some generalized sense should be in a different position is very alien and abstract. I mean, if individuals have individual specific claims for individual specific things, that is somewhat different from having a kind of, well, the statistic of a collective entity, of a group category, deserves to be in a particular position. That means that, well, as soon as that statistic has met that threshold, that then the claim falls away, the claim is paid for. Which would obviously be a state of injustice, because that means that justice can be dispensed to token representatives from that group, and as soon as the statistic is met, then it's it's okay. Well, I mean, that's one very technical way of looking at how this is a recipe for injustice that merely just tries to create a kind of appearance. It's sort of a justice via massaging and influencing and orchestrating appearances. So all these sorts of issues are held within this weird kind of strange assumption that the sociological analysis and reduction is the prime constituent of what needs to be treated, is the foremost moral entity and moral container that deserves moral consideration beyond an individual. And essentially, the also another thing that is that when you assume that the statistic is the thing that needs to be treated foremost rather than the individual, or that the individual will secondarily benefit via addressing the statistic, you get the very kind of pernicious, strange thing is that you are curing inequality, and that you are fighting inequality, and that you're treating inequality. Now, I do think that the main distinction, which is a sophisticated thing to draw, but what is actually being treated in the Constitution is not inequality, it's disadvantage. That is what is being treated, which will be specifically held by individuals, not by categories of persons, but by categories of persons, categories of disadvantage held by persons. Sort of just reading that into the how you have all those three Venn diagrams intersecting, of persons, disadvantages, and categories. What's the point here? Is that the problem with obsessing about inequality and looking at it from the sociological perspective is that the only way to justify that is that you have to imagine that the reason why the inequality is evil is because it is effectively it is intended in the system. That there's a force of will that is causing it, that there is an antagonist, there is a perpetrator. And so it says that, or it makes this weird kind of conflated assumption that there is a nefarious perpetrator at work engineering these things, and if the right segment of the population adopts the right interpretation of what their motivation should rather be, and how they should correct and filter their judgments, and how they interpret and believe things. The real problem is that inequality is fundamentally a subjective state. It's a relativistic judgment that is made. It's in some sense it's a subjective reality, and this is somewhat also admitted to by its proponents, which is why they're such stark advocates and proponents of a kind of racial relativism in terms of their epistemological outlook. Now, the problem with this is that it infuses reality, therefore, with this story about the correlation. Everything has this stark correlation to inequality being the cause of it, is that the inequality is the cause of the effect, which is essentially the adoption of the sociological paradigm as being what it is. That is fundamentally what the problem is. The diagnosis of what it is that ails people is then fundamentally equated to equality, which is very problematic, because there are many causes, there are many factors, there are many of these things, and they will never be treated when they're essentially conflated into this single kind of paradigm that can be corrected for by right think, And so it ends up alienating one from the navigation and the journey of what life involves and what life entails. And in fact, all of that essentially gets put on the back burner to this prime political vehicle and ideological navigation system, which is effectively the one-size-fits-all solution. Fix inequality, equality is the evil, which is effectively, it's assumed because it's assumed. And I mean, the fundamental problem with this is that people never reason themselves into really understanding that inequality is the root cause of problems. So you can't reason them out of it, really, because it's just a kind of, it seems like it should maybe make sense. It has a vague kind of thing. Well, let's just take that as the symbol of what moral evil is. Now, it is true that things that are problematic manifest as inequalities, but that's not the same thing to say that inequality is the root of evil. There's a fine distinction to be made here. So, and I just wanted that the language of the Constitution then is that it's trying to enhance equality and the achievement of equality. And this, I think, is also the language, really, of like the pursuit of happiness. It's not afforded by the state, it's enhanced by the state. The state is trying to enhance it. And this also comes up when I get in this discussion. I'm not going to go directly to the text, but I went into this earlier when I was discussing it in the early iterations of this chain of recordings, in which it very clearly has an or that you are promoting or you are securing people. You're not doing both simultaneously, and that distinction sort of is very important. Okay, let me just get in. So the basic problem is that unless you focus on specific advantages, specific disadvantages, inequality is just fundamentally a subjective projection. It essentially is a claim about the rationale as to why the inequality has been intended by some nefarious perpetrator in the system. Which, and just because we have some kind of flagship as to a historical perpetrator like this, then just becomes this eternal excuse to just kind of elaborate that and to sort of just diffuse that into the working principles, that have seeped into the system, and that the system needs to be cleansed of this by a which really just is an excuse essentially to not have to think about issues, to just assume that it's all this kind of, well, we need to discharge the kind of the nefarious intent, and this kind of this thinking that continues to persist under the cover of all these other things, and that they can be sorted out not by practical measures but by filtering things ideologically and forcing a kind of weird kind of synthetic field of a kind of an obscured reality in which everyone has to toe this weird kind of adjustment system in their head, which essentially stops anyone from actually having any kind of interpersonal authentic rationale in which people are actually negotiating based on underlying practical issues that are the real things that are creating impediments to proper progress and scaling up development and such. So it becomes about managing people's interpretations and their views on things, rather than actually dealing with the challenges as they present themselves on the ground. That the challenges as they present themselves on the ground are just completely translated into this weird assumption that it's all just racism. It's all just different forms of very strange racism that appears in an unintended way. So you've essentially transformed racism into something that is so disembodied from people's actual psyches that it's all just part of it gets really delusional. It becomes this orthodoxy in which you have to wholesale believe in the narrative, and it has to have this very clear dogmatic process that fixes it, and essentially you can't ever criticize that process. That process can never be wrong. So at that point it's just it becomes fundamentally authoritarian as well. Anyway, the problem with focusing on just inequality that isn't tethered to any other kind of substantive point that isn't grounded in another sort of substantive process of generating redress, is that you assume that any correlation with inequality is an aspect of moral defect or problem. Okay. And this thing can already, almost philosophically, I mean, it refutes itself, because if you just make it, you can generate any kind of subjective narrative. Then the narrative is fundamentally arbitrary. The only thing that grounds it is if you can kind of conserve a narcissistic injury and say, no, but because other people were so evil, because the conspiracy up against us is so nefarious, that is what keeps the fence of our in-group alive. And so you're stuck in this kind of underdog moral schema. You're stuck in this reactive thing in which you're under the shadow of something else that then gives you impels you to be field marshals within then the identity that needs to militarize, and such. So yeah, and yes, you can make many arguments that you can almost make inductive, persuasive things that sound persuasive arguments about how correlations to inequality, cause injustice. Um, but why not just make the independent argument? You don't have to say that, for example, what slavery is, for example, just to look at some kind of historical case, what slavery is fundamentally inequality. Slavery, to make the claim that slavery is fundamentally inequality, that is what it is not necessarily true. I mean, there are forms of slavery which do not essentially have anything to do with inequality. There are some sections of slaves that used to be Roman citizens and they became slaves. They became chattel because they were insolvent, for instance. So what slavery fundamentally is, at least in some cases, is inequality. You could say that even in the North American, legal system of the slave trade, you could say that it was motivated and facilitated by an ideology that involved inequality as a precondition for slavery occurring. But what made slavery evil is not its intention as to why it was done. It's the thing itself, which is independent of the context of the inequality. It's that it's domination. So what makes slavery evil is it's dominating and its subjugation. And you see, just to get into some of the detail of this. Now, the problem with just saying that the problem with slavery and what slavery is fundamentally is that it is inequality. That's what makes it evil. That is also to say that everyone that had any view of slavery in those times held those views about inequality. I mean, and that is a huge assumption. You can't know that. You can't know that everyone had the same view about inequality. I mean, people have different views as to, just because that is how the legal system functioned. So again, everything gets just cart-loaded into this sociological reduction and generalized into this kind of pervasive fact, which is by no means how it even operated on the ground. Yes, there were probably some slave owners that were absolute monsters, and some had completely different intentions and motivations and beliefs. There were a whole array of belief structures probably on the side of the perpetrator class, which is also a very small section of the population as well. But it's strange how essentially you just reduce everything into a single evil. That the source of all evil is inequality. It's a disembodied thing. It's very dislocated from actual interpersonal relationships and dynamics and people dealing with one another. It disregards whole slews of whole huge lists of complexities and issues, just basically to have this very simplified narrative as to what the problem is, and therefore by implication what the solution might be, which is very misleading. Now, I'm not saying that you can't make an argument that what slavery is fun. If you want to say that slavery is fundamentally inequality, and that's why it's wrong, I'm not saying that you can't not make that argument. I'm just saying that that argument is fundamentally not salient. It's not salient to the issue of injustice. If you want to define injustice in such a way that is effectively, it's not normative, it just is this kind of regulatory code as that you've got this definition, which is, I would argue, it is principally, from a principled perspective, it's completely fucked up, because how can you apply that mere description to every case? You're going to have to fudge it. You're going to have to say, well, there's some inequalities which are okay and some inequalities that are not okay, and then you have to basically work out that the source of it's going to have to be characterized by a completely arbitrary measure that, oh, well, it's because some sources of inequality then make it to do with the intention of why the inequality was imposed is why we should privilege dealing with that. So you've got this very strange relationship to justice at this point, where it's effectively justice is only revenge on behalf of a kind of narcissistic injury, of which some narcissistic injuries you're allowed to be emotionally charged by, and other injuries are going to be okay simply because of the wrong think of the perpetrator. And how really alien is this to maintaining a republic, for one thing, and to having a kind of a political discourse that it's capable of actually dealing with issues, rather than essentially perpetrating emotional grievances on a strange public stage. I mean, this gets very close to, like having a kind of show trial, which a lot of the culture has almost devolved into. This is what the social justice warrior is just waiting for. They're waiting for the opportunity to stand up against the person who does not bow his or her head to the orthodoxy, and to show the strength that the narcissistic injury will deploy itself as a reactive instrument that's capable of cutting back. So in this grand gesture of promulgating an equilibrium, which is it's problematic because it doesn't ever resolve itself. In fact, it ends up calculating a further grievance against itself, and then a further need of reply, and a more radical reaction. It self-antagonizes fundamentally. I always sort of stray into these interesting tangents, and I lose my general thesis that gets into trying to fully explore these issues. So the basic fundamental problem is that the term inequality itself is a sociological jargon. It's a sociological language. It doesn't really belong to an individual perspective. It's a hypothetical paradigm to some extent. And that's what I mean when I say it's a subjective reality as well. Now, so if you're going to talk about inequality being problematic, you have to ground it in a kind of more pragmatic, concrete sort of fashion, especially if you're going to link it to a concept like injustice. You're going to have a very clear idea of what the solution to a disadvantage would be in order to define it as an injustice, because essentially the injustice is that the solution has not been implemented, and we know what the solution would be. But when you've got this incomplete solution that is always just kind of gesturing towards a greater promotion, instead of enhancing something that is already concretely in effect, you've got this non-stop spiral that is continuing to self-agonize or whatever. And so when I was discussing the issue of inequality with this friend of mine, statistics of issues used to we're talking about statistics of it and things like that. So it's weird. I mean, you can use anything to get a hunch as to what might be problematic, but I do think I've got a somewhat of an elaboration which shows the weakness of just obsessing over statistics. Statistics of issues used to identify a problem. Okay, statistics of issues. Okay, the problem is using statistics of issues. That can never just equate to being useful in identifying a problem. So, getting statistics about an issue, those statistics will never show you that there is actually a problem. Or you know, you will still need a completely independent account of the issue. And I mean, there would perhaps be a better way to go about it, which is that you actually have an individual anecdote, you actually have an individual case. And then after you work out that, okay, this person has a problem, this person has an issue, and then you ask yourself, how many other people have that issue, have that problem? And then you might imagine that the that problem has a certain scale to it, but you've already diagnosed it on the individual level, and then you've extrapolated from there, rather than going the other way down, finding a statistic of something and saying, well, these things don't match up, therefore there's a problem. Because it's fundamentally an unknown quantity when you're looking at it statistically. You don't know anything about anything in terms of what's going on there. I didn't finish that one note, which is why that didn't come out so well, but the inequality doesn't describe the problematic part of the issue, is the biggest problem with focusing on inequality. I mean, you can use it as maybe a hunch to go investigate and to go look at something, but the inequality does not describe the problematic part of the issue. And in fact, obsessing over the inequality really forces you to sympathize with a generalized category. And then you start doing things for this generalized category, which is your target of moral consideration, which is essentially, it's dislocated from actual people. It's also dehumanizing in a lot of ways. And this is why the ideology promotes autocracy and state corruption, because it invites the need of a protector to control the generalization that the narrative purports, and to administer over that generalization, or the generalization of the problem or the solution. It's a weird kind of paternalism. And it ends up also completely table thumping and just concretely kind of enforcing the generalized thinking built into it. The assumed and false generalization implied by the unilateral imposition of subtext. Which again also feeds into the people who endorse this kind of ideological paradigm, is that it amounts to a plan to automatically react to a generalization. No specific deployment of care is even necessary, because it's a generalization. It can never be wrong, only unsuccessful. In terms of doing something about it. The form of intervention can never be wrong. It can only be unsuccessful. this is also this point now is quite sort of abstract and sophisticated, but I do think that a lot of this should give people cause to almost empathize with the racists in the apartheid government. It just shows almost on some level how easy it is to fall into this very pernicious kind of thinking. Because this is the exact moral equivalent of assumption and generalization. Of people, who run on this so-called morality, are in our society, some kind of underdog hero. They're given platforms and they teach in universities. So I mean, it's. I think it can be a tremendous source of transcending. When this kind of ideological corruption is transcended, it really creates a platform for really building something of a contributive society in which we are making progress, in which we're building something that actually has the ability to actually generate wealth and opportunity for all South Africans. And when I was making these notes and thinking about this issue, I kept on recalling in my mind there was someone who, in the question and answer session, in the Progress essay talk and lecture by Gwen Ngwenya, she said, the question was, but aren't you, by saying this, undermining black professionals? And and this is the fundamental thing, is that that is a subjective reality. That is your subjective characterization of what someone is perhaps going to be going through. That a black professional is what someone is going to be. That there's a hypothetical black professional. That whole category, that whole paradigm, is fundamentally subjective. I mean, in my subjective viewpoint, there are professionals who can be described by some as black. There's no such thing as a black professional. There's a professional who can identify themselves as black or be described by black by some people. That's my subjective reality. My subjective reality is generated by my normative value system, whereas other people have different normative constitutions, effectively, in which they don't see themselves as even constructing their normative value system. They are just reacting to the facts on the ground, or something like that. They're reacting to the truth in their blood, or whatever it may be, whatever sort of weird kind of poetry that they want to rely on. So I mean, again, to bring up this point again, inequality doesn't describe the problematic part of any issue, and it promulgates this strange interpretation of everything that forces you to sympathize with generalized conditions and generalized categories. And it's within that generalization, within those stereotypes, that effectively people are they are forced to live through this very cartoonish, sort of, if that, then this is the ideological solution. If this is happening to me, it's because of the failure of adherence to social justice. It's the source of every complaint in some sense. It's the source of a complaint to every problem. Uh, yeah, so I mean, so this is the thing: is that inequality in itself is fundamentally not a wrong thing. It's not evil. It's disadvantage which is problematic. And unfairness does not belong to a generalization. It belongs to individuals. And so when equality is enhanced and the good kind of equality is being protected, it's by tackling disadvantage, specific disadvantage, not by tackling inequality. So there's a bit of a again, like a lot of these things might have to be straightened up with specific reference to what's in the Constitution, but I just wanted to sort of do it blindly. I mean, I don't think any of my reasoning cannot be kind of reconstructed with the particular distinctions that the Constitution is sort of depending on. You know, in some sense, the meaning is all that really matters. The semantics and the rhetoric or whatever is just the sort of the form that the understanding takes, right? And I'm pretty sure that everything that I've laid out will roughly fit into the distinctions that are articulated in the constitutional equality clause. Read out this one thing that I wrote right at the start, which is that effectively what we're suffering from is a normative displacement, where adherence through reaction to the so-called unjust narrative is or adherence through reaction against the a default narrative is automatically a virtue. And then you've got people with the most kind of insulation that you can have, which is that they're not contending a belief system. They're just, this is what is happening. This is what, like, it's by the words themselves. The words just have, that's what the word means. It's all sort of subtextually injected into the language. And so, you can't even debunk them because all the words are ideologically interpreted into the narrative. They represent the narrative. So all the words that you might use to try to give them insight as to how they have chosen to construct their consciousness is just you trying to colonize their mind, which is somewhat ironic because of just how programmed and brainwashed and I mean you can see this very careful in their insensitivity to the specific implications in what they propose. There's just a complete insensitivity, because the simplified narrative is not worth giving up, because they weren't reasoned into it. So how can you reason them out of it? Because they didn't choose it because they understood it. They chose it because it gives them the excuse, essentially, to absorb a very particular kind of narcissistic injury and have a collective vehicle for expressing a reaction to that. So that they can have the potential to be part of this this grand drama of responding to that injury, and sort of collectively coming up with an imaginary means of protecting themselves and securing themselves, and so you have this grand collective project on that level, which is effectively what eventually manifests as the Führer principle, which this is a slow process. It takes years, because the more time people spend in this ideological paradigm, the more jaded and cynical they get, and the more they are willing to compromise. They are willing to infiltrate any political party, because there are different variants of how the same ideology can reach its goal. So there are people in the ANC who love, they are the identity crowd. There are people in the Democratic Alliance who they have the same ideological engine. They just think that there's a more interesting path to do it through this other vehicle. So it's sort of you have these people basically who they already see themselves as these weird kind of overlords over the people, that they are the vanguard. They are the kind of the occult elites that are devising these these are the same people who will do Gestapo type tactics, to protect the movement, to father the movement, to bring the fulfillment of the promise of protecting the identity, which just seems so pure because they've got this fixed narrative of the evil that they're up against, and they see it everywhere, and they can never blame themselves for projecting it onto those elements, because essentially they've completely sacrificed their own humility and their intellectual humility. Their souls are sold into this dominion. They are led by the spirit of the false prophet, basically. I mean, there are lots of spiritual ways that you can interpret this stuff. They take on the spirit of the mob. I'm just trying to think that. What was the name of the French philosopher who talked about the mimetic stuff? He was he actually spoke about this stuff quite directly. I should actually look into him more. Anyway. Talk about him sometime. The French philosopher who talked about the mimetic stuff, Peter Thiel, refers to him quite a bit. I wish I could see the lecture from Peter Thiel talking about his work.